Wyoming Territory was a forgotten sheet of white paper in the winter of 1879. The wind did not howl. It shrieked, a high, thin sound that scraped away at the sanity of anyone left to hear it. It scoured the high plains, peeling the thin crust of ice off the snow and blasting the dark skeletons of the cottonwoods in the dry riverbeds. The mountains, vast and gray, were lost behind the curtain of falling ice. The trails were gone. The stage lines had stopped running 3 weeks prior. The world had been reduced to the inside of a snow globe, shaken hard by a mean and angry God. In the middle of this emptiness, miles from the nearest neighbor and a hard day's ride from the nearest town, sat Clara's post. It was little more than a sturdy log cabin, built strong against the wind, with a larger, colder supply barn attached to its side. A sign, nailed to the front porch, had once read, "Clara's Provisions," but the wind had taken most of the paint, leaving only the memory of the letters. Inside, Clara worked. She lived in the cabin, slept in the small room behind the counter, and conducted her business from the main space. Shelves lined the walls, holding tins of peaches, sacks of flour, coffee, beans, and the necessary vices, tobacco plugs and bottles of whiskey that were 90% water and bite. In the corner, a workbench held the things she mended for the few trappers or prospectors who passed through: broken tack, worn boots, torn canvas. Clara herself was like the landscape. She was 30, perhaps, but the high-altitude sun and the unending grief had etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, making her look nearer to 50. Her hair, the color of dried corn silk, was pulled back so tightly it seemed to pull her eyes taut. She was never without the weight on her hip. It was a Smith & Wesson .32 caliber, small but reliable. She did not keep it for rattlesnakes. She kept it for men. She moved with a deliberate, cold economy. She stocked the shelves. She swept the floor. She fed the wood into the pot-belly stove that fought a losing battle against the cold. And she waited. Her most common posture was standing by the single front window, rifle leaning against the wall nearby, staring out into the white. The supply post was a place for travelers, but no one traveled now. She was looking for something else. She was staring at the space where the trail used to be, waiting for the man who would never use it again. She was a widow. That was the polite term for it. 5 years ago, she had been Clara Mayhew, wife of James Mayhew. James was a fast hand with a Colt, a man who smiled with his eyes and who could, she believed, read the future in the flight of a hawk. He was not a killer. The town of Laramie had disagreed. A cattle agent had been found shot in the back, and the money he carried was gone. James had been seen arguing with the man 2 days earlier. That was enough. They formed a posse, dragged him from their small rented room, and held a trial that lasted 20 minutes. Clara had stood in the dusty street, screaming that he was innocent, that he was fixing a wagon wheel for the smithy at the time, that he owned no rifle of that caliber. They had hanged him anyway. They let him hang for a full day, a warning to other fast draws passing through. Clara had not cried. Not then. She had waited until they cut him down, claimed his body, and buried him herself on a hill outside of town. Then she had taken their small savings, bought the failing supply post from an old trapper, and disappeared into the snows. The coldness that seeped into her house was nothing compared to the ice that had formed inside her chest. The James she waited for at the window was not the man they hanged. It was the man who had left that morning, promising to be back for supper. He never returned. The man they gave back to her was a stranger. On this night, the wind was a solid wall of sound. The snow was not falling. It was moving sideways, parallel to the ground, a white flood that threatened to bury the cabin completely. The sun had set, though the world was no darker, only a deeper, more violent shade of gray. Clara was cleaning the bore of her Winchester by the faint light of a kerosene lamp when the sound came. It was not a knock. It was a heavy, desperate pounding on the thick wooden door. a fist striking the wood with the last of its strength. She did not startle. Her movements were fluid. The rifle was in her hands. Lever action checked, hammer resting. As she moved toward the door, she did not call out. Calling out was for people who expected friends. She cracked the door 2 inches, the safety chain catching. The wind tore at the opening, trying to rip the wood from her hand, slamming the cabin with a wall of ice particles. At first, she saw nothing but the swirling white. Then, a shape detached itself from the storm. It was a man, or what was left of one. He was tall, built wide, but he was stooped against the gale. Snow covered him so thickly he looked like a statue. Ice clung to his beard and eyebrows, turning his face into a frozen mask. On his back, he carried a heavy oilcloth sack, bulging and misshapen. He pushed his face closer to the crack, and she saw his eyes. They were dark, buried deep in their sockets, and held a raw exhaustion that went beyond the storm. They looked like the eyes of a wolf caught in a trap, beaten but not broken. "Shelter!" He forced the word through frozen lips. It was a croak. Clara's rifle did not move. "Post is closed. Storm's too bad." "I'll freeze," he said. It was not a plea. It was a statement of fact. "Won't make another mile." "That's not my concern." Her voice was flat, as cold as the air between them. The man sagged against the doorframe, the last of his strength going. He fumbled with the strap on his back, his gloved hands clumsy and stiff. He worked the sack around to his front and pulled the flap. He reached inside. Clara's thumb moved to the hammer of the Winchester. But he did not pull a gun. He pulled out a fur. It was a beaver pelt, thick, dark, and perfectly cured. He dropped it in the snow at her doorstep. Then another, and another. He counted them out, his voice a low rasp, lost in the wind. 8, 9, 10. He dropped the 10th pelt. 10 prime beaver pelts. In any other weather, it was a small fortune, enough to keep her in supplies for half a year. 10 furs, he gasped. For one night, just the floor, just till the storm breaks. Clara looked at the furs, then at the man. He was carrying a rifle. She could see the stock of it caked in snow. He wore a revolver high on his hip, tied down in the way of a man who used it often. He was danger, but he was also dying. And he was offering to pay. She had not had a customer in a month. She looked past him, into the impenetrable white. There was no one else. He was alone. "The barn," she said, her voice sharp. "You can take the storeroom in the barn." He nodded, a jerky, painful motion. Clara shut the door, her heart pounding a dull, heavy beat. She slid the heavy bar clear. She opened the door wide enough for him to fall inside. He stumbled past her, bringing the frozen world in with him. He collapsed onto the wooden floorboards, the heavy sack landing beside him with a solid thud. Snow and ice melted off him immediately, forming a dirty puddle on her clean floor. He lay there for a long minute, just breathing. Clara barred the door. The sound of the wind quieted, muffled by the wood, but it was still there, pressing on the cabin. The man pushed himself up to his elbows. He was younger than she first thought, maybe 40. His face was hard, cut from granite, with a thick beard and a nose that had been broken more than once. He looked, she thought, like a man who had been buried and dug himself back out. He pushed his hood back. His name, he said, was Eli. He offered nothing else. Clara nodded once, acknowledging it. "There's a stove in the storeroom, no wood. You'll have to use your own, if you have it." "I have nothing," he said. His voice was raw. Clara stared at him. The code of the prairie demanded she offer warmth. The code of her survival demanded she offer nothing. The furs lay outside, already being covered by the new snow. "Wait here," she commanded. She pulled on her own heavy coat and boots, took a lantern, and went back out into the blizzard. The wind nearly knocked her from the porch. She fought her way to the woodpile, her arms aching as she gathered several logs, and then pushed open the heavy barn door. The storeroom was a small, windowless space she used for excess flour and tools. It was colder than the cabin, but it was out of the wind. She lit the small stove, the kind used in shepherd's wagons, and waited until the kindling caught before adding the logs. The small space filled with the smell of pine smoke. When she returned, Eli had not moved. He was watching her, his dark eyes following her every step. "It's lit," she said. "The furs. I'll take them in the morning, if they're still there." "They'll be there," he said. He grabbed his sack, which he had not let go of, and used the wall to pull himself to his feet. He was tall, taller than James had been. He filled her small cabin, made the ceiling feel low. She pointed to the door. He nodded and walked out into the small covered walkway that connected the cabin to the barn. She watched him go, then barred the connecting door from her side. For a long time, she stood in the center of the room, listening. She heard the faint sound of him moving in the storeroom, the scrape of wood. Then, silence, save for the wind. She was alone again, but the house felt occupied. An hour later, her own small stove crackled. The cabin was as warm as it ever got. She had made her own supper, a thin stew of salted pork and dried beans. It was bland, but it was hot. She found herself making too much. Her hand had, by habit, measured for 2. She looked at the pot. She looked at the barred door to the barn. The man had paid 10 furs. He had paid for shelter. Not food, but a dead man could not retrieve his payment in the morning. She cursed, quietly. She ladled a full portion into a second bowl. She put the bowl, a spoon, and a piece of hardtack on a tray. She unbarred the door and carried the tray to the storeroom. He was not sleeping. He was sitting on a stack of feed sacks, his back against the wall, his rifle across his lap. His wet coat and sack were hanging near the stove, dripping onto the dirt floor. The room was warmer now, the smoke rising steadily from the chimney pipe. He had not taken off his boots. When she entered, his hand went to the pistol on his hip. He stopped when he saw the tray. His eyes lifted from the food to her face. It was the first time they had truly looked at each other. In that small, smoky room, Clara saw that his isolation was as deep as her own. It was a different kind, a jagged, hunted loneliness, while hers was a dull, frozen ache. But it was the same language. She set the tray on a barrel. "Eat," she said. It was an order, not an offer. He looked at the steam rising from the bowl. He had not eaten a hot meal in days, maybe weeks. "I have no more furs," he said, his voice quiet. "I'm not asking for any," Clara said, turning to leave. "Wait." She stopped, her hand on the door latch, her back to him. "Sit," he said, "please." She did not know why she listened. Perhaps it was the first time in 5 years anyone had said please to her. She turned, her expression unchanged, and sat on the only other seat, a small keg of nails. She kept her hands in her lap, near the pistol she still wore under her apron. They ate in silence. The only sounds were the scrape of spoons against tin bowls and the high, constant scream of the wind outside. The air in the room was close, smelling of wet wool, pine smoke, and the faint, metallic scent of the man himself. The candlelight from her lantern cast deep shadows, making the planes of his face look sharp and worn. He ate quickly, but not like an animal. He ate like a man who had forgotten the comfort of food and was trying to remember it. The cold was so bad that when they breathed, small white clouds formed in front of their faces, even near the stove. He finished first. He set the bowl down and wiped his mouth on his sleeve. He looked at Clara, who was pushing the last bean around her bowl. "You ever love someone you couldn't forget?" The question struck the silence and shattered it. It was sudden, too personal, and it came from a place she had not let herself visit in years. Clara's spoon stopped. She did not look up. The wind seemed to pause. waiting for her answer. "Forgetting is easy," she said, her voice barely audible. "Living with the memory is the hard part." She stood abruptly, her chair scraping the dirt floor. She picked up the tray, avoiding his gaze. His eyes were too sharp. They saw too much. She felt as if he had peeled back the skin on her arm and looked at the blood beneath. "Whiskey," she said, more to herself than to him. "It's cold." She went back to the cabin, her hands shaking slightly. Not from the cold. She grabbed the bottle of cheap rye she kept for herself, not the watered-down stock for customers. She poured a heavy measure into a tin cup, her back to the connecting door, as if he could see her through the wood. She drank it standing up, the burn in her throat a welcome, familiar pain. She did not offer him any. That night, she went to her small bed, but sleep would not come. The cabin felt wrong. The presence of another living, breathing person in her sanctuary was an intrusion, a violation of the cold peace she had built. She got up, wrapped a heavy quilt around her shoulders, and went to the front window. The storm had not lessened. The world was still a frantic, endless white. She could not see the storeroom from here, but she could feel his presence. She could feel the weight of him. A stranger, a hunter, a man with haunted eyes, sleeping just 20 feet away. She stood there for hours, the quilt held tight, watching the snow bury the world, feeling the ghost of her husband at her shoulder and the dangerous, living warmth of the man in her barn. The morning broke gray and heavy. The wind had died down from a shriek to a low, weary moan, but the world it left behind was paralyzed. When Clara opened her cabin door, she faced a solid wall of white. The drift was over 5 feet high, burying her porch and pressing against the wood. She had to fight the door closed again. She went to the connecting passage to the barn, but that, too, was sealed. The wind had packed the snow into the narrow space like stone. The man was trapped in the storeroom, and she was trapped in the cabin. She took her shovel, wrapped her face in a scarf, and went out the back window, sinking to her waist in the powder. It took her the better part of an hour to dig a narrow trench to the main barn door. Her muscles burned and her lungs raw from the frozen air. When she finally pulled the heavy door open, Eli was standing just inside. He was not waiting to be rescued. He was trying to dismantle a section of the wall to get out. He held a pry bar in his hands. He stopped when he saw her. He was covered in sawdust and sweat, despite the bitter cold in the barn. "The drift," she said, her voice muffled by the scarf. "I noticed," he said. He dropped the pry bar. "I thought you might be buried in there." "I was not," she said too sharply. They stood for a moment, breathing hard in the gray light. The silence of the new snow was absolute. "The wind tore shingles from the main roof," she said, gesturing with her shovel. "And the woodpile's gone." He nodded. He picked up the shovel she had dropped. "Show me." For the rest of the day, they worked. It was not a partnership. It was a truce, forced by the weather. The world was too big and too mean to survive alone, and the storm had made them, for this one day, a single unit. Eli was a man who knew how to use his hands. He dug out the woodpile with a fierce, steady energy. He took her axe, tested its balance, and began to split the frozen logs. The sound of the steel hitting the wood was the only sound in the world, a sharp, clean thwack that punctuated the silence. He did not split wood. He attacked it, as if each log was a personal enemy. Clara watched him for a time. He worked with a contained violence. He built a new, higher stack on the porch, where the wind could not bury it so easily. While he worked, she went inside to heat coffee and what was left of the stew. When she came out, he was inspecting the roofline. "It's bad," he said, pointing up. "The wind got under the south edge. It's loosened half the row." "I know," she said. "I'll fix it when it thaws." "It won't wait for a thaw. More snow comes. That whole section gives way. You'll lose your stock." He ate the stew standing up, fast and efficient. Then he went to the barn, found her ladder, and climbed onto the roof without asking. Clara followed, standing at the base of the ladder, feeding him the shingles and tools he called for. He worked in the biting wind, his fingers bare, handling the hammer and nails with a precision that surprised her. He was not a clumsy man. He was a man of purpose. "You've done this before," she called up. "I've done most things before," he shouted down, his voice snatched by the wind. "Montana, Colorado, trapping, mining, building. You don't stay in one place. You learn to do for yourself." He hammered the last shingle in place as the light began to fail. He climbed down, his face rimmed with ice, his hands raw and red. He stopped on the last rung, his face level with hers. "I've been hunting mostly these last few years," he said, his voice quiet now. "Selling the furs? It's a clean life. Animals are honest." Clara just listened, holding the empty bucket that had held the nails. "People ain't honest," he said. "I met a man in Montana, a dispute over a trap line. He said I was stealing. I wasn't." He looked past her, at the endless white. "He drew on me. I was faster, but it was a terrible accident." Clara felt the cold seep deeper, a cold that had nothing to do with the snow. "Accidents happen," she said, her voice flat. "Not this kind," Eli said. "I killed him. It was a fair draw, but I killed him. And his sons saw it. They don't care that it was fair. They just care that I'm walking and he's not." He finally stepped off the ladder, stamping his feet to bring the feeling back. He reached out, not to touch her, but to take the bucket. His frozen fingers brushed the back of her hand. Clara recoiled as if she had been burned. She dropped the bucket. It clattered on the frozen porch steps. She stared at her hand, then at him, her eyes wide with a sudden, sharp panic. It was the first human touch she had felt in 5 years, and it felt like a violation. She saw the confusion in his face, then the quick, dark understanding. He pulled his hand back. He started. "Don't," she said, her voice tight. She grabbed the bucket and fled inside the cabin, barring the connecting door behind her. The afternoon died. The sky turned from gray to a deep, bruised purple, and the wind began to rise again. Clara sat in her cabin, at her workbench, trying to mend a leather strap, but her hands were shaking. She kept feeling the ghost of his touch on her skin. She heard him moving in the barn, the sound of him clearing the storeroom, stacking the sacks, the scrape of the stove. He was not leaving. He could not. The sun set. The cabin grew dark, save for the single lamp she lit. She made her supper, cornbread and molasses, but she made no extra. She would not go to him again. She sat by her own stove, the potbelly stove in the center of the room. She held her hands out to it, but they would not get warm. The wind howled, louder this time. The cabin groaned under the pressure. The silence she had cultivated for 5 years was gone, replaced by the sound of the storm and the knowledge of the man just on the other side of the wall. After an hour, the silence from the barn became as loud as the wind. She found herself listening for his movements, for the sound of his breathing. There was nothing. "Fool," she whispered to herself. She put on her coat, took the lamp, and unbarred the door. The barn was freezing. The small stove in the storeroom had gone out. Eli was not in the storeroom. He was sitting on a hay bale in the main part of the barn, wrapped in his bedroll, his rifle across his lap. He was shivering, but he had not come to her door. "The stove is out," she said. "I'm out of wood," he said. His teeth were chattering. "I used the last of it. I'm not taking yours." "You'll die out here," she said. "I've been colder," he replied. "You're a stubborn fool. And you're a hard woman," he shot back, his voice rough. They stared at each other in the flickering lamplight. "I was in the Bitterroots," he said, his voice tight from the cold. "Back in '74, got caught in a blizzard. Worse than this, horse broke its leg, had to shoot it." Clara stood still, the lamp held high. I dug into a drift, had my robe. I lay there for 2 days, maybe 3. The snow buried me. It got quiet. So quiet, you can hear your own heart stop. He looked up at her, his eyes dark in the shadows. I hate the quiet. It's the sound of being buried. I thought I was dead. I was warm. For the first time, I knew it was the end. A Shoshone hunting party found me, dug me out. I was snowblind, lost 2 toes. He pulled his bedroll tighter. I'd rather freeze out here listening to that wind than sit in a quiet room waiting for nothing. Clara looked at him, at this big, stubborn man choosing to freeze rather than impose. He was afraid of silence. She turned. Get your things. He didn't move. Get your things, she repeated, her voice sharp. The storeroom is drifted in. The door's blocked from the outside. You can't stay here. You're coming into the cabin. He slowly, stiffly, got to his feet, grabbing his sack and rifle. I will not live by silence, she said, more to herself than to him. But I will not let a man die for it. She led him into the main cabin. The warmth hit him like a physical blow. You take the chair, she said, pointing to the rocker by the stove. I'll take the floor. Ma'am, I can't. You will, she said, cutting him off. I won't have this argument. You are a guest who paid 10 furs. You will not sleep on my floor. She took her own bedroll, the one she used for rare trips to Laramie, and spread it on the floor near the counter. It was as far from him as she could get. He sat in the chair, his rifle leaning against it. He did not take off his boots. They sat in the small, warm room, listening to the storm try to tear the roof off. They did not sleep. For hours, they just sat. The clock on the shelf ticked, a loud, heavy sound. The stove crackled. Why did you flinch? He asked, his voice low. Clara, wrapped in her blankets on the floor, did not pretend to misunderstand. No one's touched me, she said to the darkness. Not since James. Your husband. She nodded, though he probably couldn't see her. 5 years, 5 years, 3 months. He die out here? He died in Laramie. She took a deep, shuddering breath. The confession she had given to no one was rising in her throat. He was a good man, she whispered. He wasn't hard, not like you. He was soft. He liked to read books. He whistled, always whistling. Eli stayed quiet, his shape a dark mass in the chair. They said he shot a cattle agent, in the back, for money. She laughed, a short, bitter sound. James wouldn't know which end of a man was his back, and he hated money. He just wanted to build a small ranch, raise horses. But they said he did it. They wanted someone to blame. James, he wasn't from here. He was from the East. He talked different. They didn't like him. So when the agent was found, they formed a posse. They didn't get the sheriff. They just took him. Her voice was cracking, the ice of 5 years breaking apart. They held a trial in the saloon. It took 20 minutes. I stood outside. I screamed. I told them he was innocent, that he was fixing a wagon wheel for the smithy. The smithy! He lied. He said he hadn't seen him. He was afraid of them. She was crying now, silent, hot tears running into her hair. They dragged him out. They had a rope. He looked at me. He wasn't scared. He was just sad. He looked at me, and he said, I'm sorry, Clara. And then they threw the rope over the sign for the hotel. They pulled him up. She choked on the word. They made me watch. They left him there, all day, as a warning. The cabin was silent. The wind itself seemed to have stopped, listening. The only sound was Clara's ragged, stifled sobs, the sounds she had held back for half a decade. She heard the chair scrape. She tensed, pulling the blanket up. Eli stood up, in the faint orange glow from the stove. He was a mountain. He unbuckled his heavy gun belt and laid it on the counter. The sound was loud, deliberate. He took off his heavy coat. He did not walk to her bed. He walked to the space beside it. And he knelt. He knelt on the floorboards, so his face was level with hers. She could see the faint glint of the fire in his eyes. He looked worn, coy, as she had first seen him. He did not speak. He did not offer comfort. He just looked at her, his gaze holding hers, acknowledging the depth of the horror she had described. Then, slowly, as if testing thin ice, he raised his hand. It was the same scarred, hard hand that had fixed her roof. He did not touch her face or her hair. He moved his fingers, rough and calloused, to the side of her neck, just below her ear, his thumb brushing the line of her jaw. It was a touch of impossible, terrible gentleness, a touch that rested on the very place the rope would have scarred. "I've been hunted, too," he whispered, his voice a gravelly rasp, "for things I didn't mean to do." Clara stopped breathing. A violent, electric shudder ran through her entire body. It was not a flinch of fear. It was a jolt of life, a feeling so long forgotten it was agonizing. The last ember in the stove popped, casting a momentary, bright flare of light. It lit his weathered face, the deep lines of sorrow and guilt, and it lit her, her eyes wide and overflowing, her face wet with the tears of 5 lost years. They stayed there, 2 trembling souls, suspended in the single, shared moment of their breaking. The world was born new, and sharp, and blindingly white. The storm had passed in the darkest hour of the morning, leaving an unbroken silence in its wake. The sky was a pale, hard blue, so high and cold it hurt to look at. Sunlight, for the first time in days, struck the endless fields of snow, shattering into a million points of light. It was beautiful, and it was a lie. The temperature had dropped 20 degrees. The air was not cold. It was thin, sharp, and deadly, freezing the moisture in a man's lungs. Inside the cabin, the spell of the night had broken with the dawn. The intimacy of their shared confessions felt unreal in the harsh light. Clara had risen from the floor stiffly, her body aching, her face blotchy and swollen from her tears. Eli had moved from the chair, his own face a mask of exhaustion. They had not spoken of what passed between them, his touch on her neck, her unraveled grief. It all hung in the air. A second, invisible smoke. They drank coffee, black and bitter, standing on opposite sides of the room. The silence was no longer the comfortable one of a shared meal. It was the awkward, heavy silence of 2 people who had seen too much of each other, too fast. Clara was scrubbing the tin plates with a handful of snow when she heard it. It was not the wind. It was the creak of snow under heavy hooves, and the low snort of tired horses. Eli heard it, too. He did not move, but his entire body went still. He was a statue, his head tilted, his hand resting on the counter, inches from the gun belt he had put back on at first light. Clara moved to the window, wiping a patch of frost from the glass. 3 riders. They were dark shapes against the blinding snow, moving slowly, their horses struggling through the deep drifts. They were not trappers. They were heavy, armed men, and they rode with the slumped shoulders of a long pursuit. "You know them," Clara stated. It was not a question. Eli's voice was flat. "Get behind the counter. Stay there." "This is my post," she said, her voice hard, though her heart was a cold knot in her stomach. "Not today, it ain't," he said. He moved to the door, his rifle in his left hand, his right hand free. He did not position himself as a target, but stood to the side, his back against the solid log wall. The riders stopped. They sat on their horses for a long minute, just looking at the cabin, at the thin wisp of smoke from the chimney, a sign of life in a dead world. One of them dismounted, his movement stiff. He was a big man, his face hidden under a heavy fur hat and a thick, frozen beard. The other 2 followed. Their spurs chimed on the porch boards. Then, a heavy boot kicked the door, shaking the frame. Not a knock, a summons. Eli looked at Clara. His eyes were cold, the eyes of the man who had first appeared in the storm. "I'll handle this. Don't speak." He eased the bar back and opened the door a foot. The man in the lead pushed his way in, not waiting for an invitation. He was tall and broad, with a buffalo coat that stank of old sweat, whiskey, and wet animal. His eyes were small and dark, like buried pieces of coal. Behind him came two others. One was older, thin and wiry, with a long scar that pulled one side of his mouth into a permanent sneer. The last one was younger, maybe 25, with a restless energy and eyes that darted everywhere. "Closed," Clara said from behind the counter, her own Smith & Wesson now resting on the wood, just under her left hand. "Don't look closed." The big man rumbled. His name was Silas. He looked around the small cabin, his gaze taking in the shelves, the stove, and finally, Clara. "Just look cold. We need whiskey." The young one, Caleb, said. His voice was high and sharp. "And feed for the horses. We've been tracking 3 days in this hell." "I've got feed." Clara said, "Whiskey's 2 bits a glass." "We'll take the bottle," Silas said. He turned his head and looked, really looked, at Eli for the first time. Eli had not moved from the wall. He was just a shape in the corner, his face shadowed. The room went quiet. The only sound was the drip of melting snow from the men's coats. Caleb, the young one, stepped forward, squinting. "I know you." Eli was silent. "I said, I know you," Caleb said, his hand moving to rest on the butt of his pistol. "You're him. You're the one. You're Abel." Clara's breath caught. "Abel." Eli shifted, just slightly. "You're mistaken. Friend, name's Eli." "Don't you lie to me!" the young man shrieked, his voice cracking. He ripped his glove off and pointed a raw, trembling finger. "That's him! Silas! That's him! 10 years and that's him! Abel Heston!" Silas, the leader, looked at Eli, his cold dark eyes showing no expression. The third man, Boone, the one with the scar, just smiled, revealing yellowed teeth. "The boy's got a sharp eye. Abel," Silas said, his voice a low rumble. "I told you," Eli said, his voice dangerously soft. "You're mistaken." "Are we?" Caleb was vibrating with a rage that filled the small room. "We've been tracking you from Montana, lost your trail in the blizzard, thought you'd hold up, and here you are, taking coffee with a widow." Clara saw Eli's right hand. It was tensed, fingers spread, hovering just above his holster. He was ready, but he did not draw. "I don't know you," Eli said, "and I don't know the name. Now you can buy your whiskey and your feed and move on, or you can just move on. Makes no mind to me." Silas stared at Eli for a long, hard count of 5. He was measuring him. He was measuring the room. He saw Clara, her hand on her own pistol. He saw the rifle in Eli's left hand. He saw the potbelly stove in the center of the room. He saw that a gunfight in here would kill everyone. "The boy's upset," Silas said at last, his voice almost reasonable. "Been a long ride. He gets confused." "I ain't confused," Caleb shouted, lunging forward. Silas's arm shot out, a limb of iron, and stopped him. "He ain't confused," Silas said, "but he is eager, and this ain't the place. We'll take our feed, and a bottle." Clara's hands were shaking, but her voice was steady. "The feed's in the barn. It's $2 a bag, bottles $1. Silas dropped $3 silver on the counter. "Boone, go with the lady. Get 2 bags. Clara looked at Eli. He gave a single, sharp nod. She took her pistol, put it in her apron pocket, and led the man called Boone, the man with the scar, to the barn. She was aware of his eyes on her back every step of the way. When she returned, Silas and Caleb were standing at the door. Eli had not moved. The tension was so thick she could barely breathe. "We'll be at the old line shack," Silas said, not to Clara, but to Eli. "Down by the frozen creek, about 3 miles west. We'll be resting the horses. This ain't over, Abel." "My name is Eli," he said. "Whatever you call yourself," Silas sneered. "The snow's deep. You can't run far. We'll see you soon." They left. The door closed, and the room was plunged back into silence. But it was a different silence now. It was the silence of a held breath. Clara watched them from the window until they were just 3 dark specks against the snow. Then she turned. "Abel," she said. Eli closed his eyes for a second, a flicker of pain crossing his face. He let out a long breath and slid his rifle onto the counter. "They're the ones," he said, "from Montana. The ones who saw you kill their kin." "Yes." "And you just let them leave?" Her voice was rising, sharp with fear and a new, cold anger. "They know you're here. They know I'm here. They're 3 miles away. What did you think you were doing?" "A fight in here?" Eli said, turning to face her. "Clara, there was no winning that. Not for you." "So you let them go, to come back, to burn me out?" "They won't come back right away. They'll wait. They'll plan." "And you'll just—" "What, wait for them?" I'll leave," he said, but the words had no life in them. "You should have shot them," she whispered, her hands clenched. "You had the drop on them when they came in." "I don't kill men like that," he said, his voice low. "You kill them! You told me! You killed their father!" "I told you it was an accident," he said, his voice ragged. "I told you—" "You told me it was a fair draw!" she cried. "You told me it was self-defense! You lied to me!" "I didn't lie!" he shouted, his own control finally breaking. He slammed his fist on the counter, making the tins jump. I didn't tell it all." "Then tell it," she commanded, her fear turning to pure, hot rage. "You brought this to my door. You brought 3 armed men to my home. You tell me why I shouldn't shoot you myself and drag your body out to them." Eli looked at her, and the fight went out of him. He looked old, older than the mountains. He slumped into the chair by the stove, the one he had sat in all night. "His name was Caleb," he said, his voice hollow. "The young one, that's Caleb Jr. His father was Caleb Sr. It was in Colorado, not Montana, 10 years ago." He stared at the stove, his hands clasped between his knees. "It was a land dispute, a stupid, worthless piece of creek-bottom land. I had filed a claim. Another man, Boone, the one with the scar. He filed one, too. He was there with his brother, Silas. They said I had jumped their claim. I hadn't." He paused, gathering the memory. "We met in town, in the saloon, to talk it over with the agent. It got loud. Boone was a mean drunk. He called me a liar. I called him a cheat. He went for his gun. I knew he would. He was that kind." "So you drew?" Clara asked, her voice like ice. "I did," Eli whispered. "I was faster. I always was. I fired. But Caleb Sr., the father, he was just standing at the bar. He wasn't part of it. He was a rancher from down the valley. He was just there. He had come in to get a beer. And when Boone staggered back, he knocked into him." Eli covered his face with his hands. "The bullet, it went through Boone's shoulder, clean. He lived, but it hit Caleb Sr. in the chest. He just looked at me, surprised. He didn't even know what happened. He just slid to the floor. He was dead before I could get to him. His son, the boy who was just here, he was 15. He was outside, holding his father's horse. He ran in. He saw me, with the gun in my hand, and his father on the floor." The cabin was dead silent. "It wasn't a fair draw," Clara said, her voice shaking. It wasn't self-defense. You shot an innocent man. You killed a father in front of his son. It was an accident, Eli roared, jumping to his feet. It was an accident. I was aiming for Boone. I never even saw the other man, but it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter what I meant. He was dead, and I was the one holding the gun. And you ran? I didn't run, he said. I stayed. I was arrested. But Silas and Boone, they told the sheriff I murdered him, that I shot an unarmed man in cold blood. The town, they believed them. They formed a mob, just like yours. The sheriff, he knew I wouldn't get a trial. He let me go. He told me to ride and never come back. I've been riding ever since, and Silas, Boone, and the boy, they've been hunting me. They don't want a trial. They want a rope or a bullet. Clara stared at him, her face pale. Everything he said was a twisted echo of her own life. A lie, a mob, a man run out of town. But there was one difference. James was innocent, she said, her voice a low, trembling wire. He never killed anyone. Clara, you did, she said. By accident, by intent. It doesn't matter. You killed him. You brought this plague to my door. The same plague that killed my husband. You are just like them. Clara, that's not fair. Fair? She shrieked. You talked to me about fair. I gave you shelter. I gave you food. I listened to you. I told you. God, I told you about James. And you sat there, knowing you were the very thing I despised. A killer. Hiding. A liar. I am not a liar. Get out, she said. Eli stood frozen. What? Get out. Her voice was low and deadly. She pulled the Smith & Wesson from her pocket and pointed it at his chest. Get your things and get out of my house. Clara, you can't, he said, his eyes pleading. It's 20 below out there. There's no shelter for 50 miles, except their shack. You're sending me to my death. They're going to kill you anyway, she said, her hands trembling so hard she had to grip the pistol with both. But they will not do it here. They will not burn my home. They will not drag me into your fight. This is my place. The only thing I have left. You will not take it from me. I won't let them, he said. I'll leave. I'll draw them off. Just let me wait until dark. Now. You leave now. I want to watch you go. I want to know you're gone. The cruelty in her own voice scared her. But she fed on it. It was a shield against the fear. Eli looked at her for a long, terrible moment. He saw the terror in her eyes, the blind, cornered animal fear that had replaced the woman who had cried in his arms. He saw that there was nothing he could say. Slowly, his shoulders slumped. He nodded once. He walked to the corner and picked up his heavy coat. He put it on, his movements slow and deliberate. He picked up his rifle. He went to the door and grabbed his snowshoes from where they rested against the wall. Then he turned back. He looked at the counter, where his oilcloth sack lay, the sack with the 10 beaver pelts. He picked it up and held it out to her. This is yours, he said, his voice quiet. The payment. I kept my end. Clara looked at the bag. The price of one night. The price of her safety. The price of his life. She stepped forward and slapped the bag from his hand. It hit the floor with a heavy, soft thud. The furs spilled out, dark and rich on the dusty floorboards. I never took anything from a man who'd abandoned me in the night. She spat. His face contorted, as if she had struck him. I'm not abandoning. You are, she cut him off. You're leaving, just like he did. Get out. He looked at the furs on the floor. He looked at her. Then he turned, unbarred the door, and stepped out into the blinding, frozen sunlight. Clara moved to the window, her pistol still in her hand. She watched him strap on his snowshoes. He did not look back. He turned his face west, toward the creek, toward the men who were hunting him. and began to walk. He was a single, dark figure in an ocean of white. She watched until he was a small dot. She watched until he disappeared behind a snowdrift. And then he was gone. The cabin was silent. Clara slid to the floor, her back against the wall, the gun heavy in her lap. The silence she had craved was back. It was absolute. It was suffocating. It was the sound of a man walking to his grave. She had done it. She had saved herself. She had cast out the danger. She had become the town she hated. She sat there as the sun moved across the sky. The cabin grew cold as the fire in the stove died. She did not move. She just stared at the furs, spilled on her floor. Night fell. The cold became a physical presence, a heavy, creeping thing. She was frozen, not by the air, but by the ice in her own heart. Finally, she moved. Her limbs were stiff. She lit the lamp. The small flame was a weak defense against the dark. She went to the stove and automatically, from years of habit, added wood. The fire caught, the cabin slowly regaining its meager warmth. She looked at the furs. She looked at the door. She had killed him. The thought was a sharp, physical pain. She went to the small, dark room in the back, her bedroom. Under her cot was an old wooden chest, James's chest. She had not opened it since the day she buried him. Her fingers trembled as she undid the leather straps. The hinges creaked in protest. The smell of him hit her. Faint tobacco, old leather, and soap. She pulled out his Sunday shirt, the one he was buried in. Underneath, a book of poetry, a small, tin box. Inside the box was a tintype of them, on their wedding day. He was smiling, his arm around her. She looked like a girl she had never known, her face soft and open. And under the tintype, a folded piece of paper. His last letter, written from the Laramie jail, on paper smuggled in by a sympathetic drunk. She had read it once, and then hidden it, unable to bear the words. She unfolded it. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely read the faded pencil script. My dearest Clara, they will not let me see you. They say the sentence is tomorrow at dawn. Do not come. Do not watch. My love, I beg you, remember me as I was this morning. I am not afraid, but I am angry. I did not do this. You know I did not. I was at the smithy, as I told you. But it is one man's word against another, and I am the stranger here. The agent, Mr. Henderson. He was arguing with a man at the saloon 2 nights past. I heard it, a loud man, a big man with a gray beard. Henderson said he had sold the same parcel of land twice. The man said he would see Henderson in hell for it. I told the sheriff. He would not listen. The man's name, he is a freighter. I think he was here with 2 others. His name is Silas Croft. Clara stopped reading. The paper fell from her fingers. Silas Croft. The man with the coal-black eyes. The leader of the 3. The man who was, at this very moment, 3 miles away, waiting to kill Eli. He had been here. He had been in her home. The man who had lied. The man who had seen her husband framed. He was here. And she had just sent Eli, the only other man who knew the truth of a different killing, to his death. She grabbed the letter and ran to the door. She tore it open and screamed his name into the frozen, moonlit night. Eli! The only answer was the high, thin echo of her own voice, dying in the vast, cold dark. The letter was a brittle, yellowed ghost in her frozen hand. Silas Croft. The name was a brand, burning a 5-year-old wound open. It was not grief she felt. It was a white-hot, clarifying rage that melted the ice inside her. She had been a fool, a blind, cowering fool. She had sat in her cold cabin, a living memorial to a man she thought was a victim of random, faceless cruelty. But he was not. He was the victim of a single, specific man, a man who had been in her home, a man who had looked at her with his dead, coal-black eyes and bought whiskey from her. And she had sent the only other person caught in that man's web, the only other man who knew what Silas was, to his death. "No," she whispered. The word was a puff of white smoke, stolen by the wind. She was not a widow, mourning. She was an executioner. She had passed sentence on Eli, and the crime had been his, and James's, and her own. The crime of being in Silas Croft's way. She ran back inside. The furs were still on the floor, a dark, rich accusation. She kicked them aside. She did not feel the cold. The fire in her belly was all the warmth she needed. She moved with a speed she had not known in years. Her hands, which had trembled all day, were rock steady. She pulled on her heaviest coat, the sheepskin-lined one. She wrapped her face in a thick wool scarf, leaving only her eyes. She grabbed her Winchester, checking the load, and shoved a box of cartridges into her deep pocket. She put on her fur-lined gloves. She went to the small pantry. She grabbed a sack and filled it. Hardtack, a frozen slab of bacon, a tin of coffee, a small skin of brandy. It was the brandy James had been saving. She did not hesitate. She slammed the cabin door, not bothering to bar it. The barn was a frigid tomb. Her horse, a tough winter-hardened buckskin named Grits, whinnied in the dark. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice a low, hard thing. She worked by feel, her fingers sure on the buckles of the saddle. She bridled him, pulling the frozen bit from under her coat where she had warmed it. She strapped the small tent and her bedroll to the cantle, alongside the sack of food. She led the horse out into the moonlight. The world was a terrible, beautiful expanse of blue-white, so bright it hurt the eyes. The wind was a razor, slicing at any exposed skin. The tracks Eli had made on his snowshoes were already fading, the wind scouring the sharp edges. But they were there, a faint, desperate trail of dimples in the snow, leading west. She put her boot in the stirrup and swung herself up. The leather was stiff and cold. She settled the rifle across her lap, took the reins, and kicked the horse into a lunging, difficult walk. The ride was a special kind of hell. The snow was deep, chest high on the horse in the drifts, and Grits had to lunge and flounder, his breath tearing from his lungs in great, ragged clouds. The cold was a physical weight. It pressed on her chest, crawled under her layers, and tried to find her bones. The wind was a constant, high-pitched scream. It came from the north, an unending wall of force that pushed at her and the horse, trying to drive them south. It whipped ice particles into her face, stinging her eyes until they were slits, weeping frozen tears that clung to her scarf. She did not think. She just rode. She fixed her eyes on the tracks. Silas Croft. The name was a rhythm, matching the plod-plod lunge of the horse. Silas Croft. He had framed her husband. He had watched her life burn down. Silas Croft. He was hunting Eli. Silas Croft. She rode past the line shack Silas had spoken of. It was 3 miles west, as he'd said, a dark, ugly smudge against the snow, nestled in a small canyon cut by the frozen creek. A single, dull orange light glowed in its window. A thread of smoke rose from its chimney, instantly torn to shreds by the wind. They were in there, drinking her whiskey, warm, waiting. She turned her horse away, pushing him harder, up the embankment and onto the high ridge. Eli had not gone to them. He had gone around. He was running, just as he said he would. She climbed. The land was broken here, full of rocky outcrops and steep, wind-scoured slopes where the horse's hooves slipped on the bare, frozen stone. The wind was worse on the ridge. It was a solid, moving thing, a river of air that threatened to peel her from the saddle. She bent low, her face against the horse's neck, her hand, even in the thick glove, aching from its grip on the reins. The moon began to set, and the world was plunged into a deep, confusing gray. The tracks were almost impossible to see. She had to dismount, her legs stiff and useless, and walk, leading the horse. Her eyes inches from the ground, searching for the faint, brushed mark of the snowshoes. She was cold, a deep, penetrating cold that had moved past shivering. Her mind was becoming slow, the rage fading into a dull, thudding exhaustion. She was going to die out here. She knew it. She had sent Eli to his death, and now she was following him. It was fitting. Then she smelled it, faint, sharp, and acrid. Wood smoke. She raised her head. The sky was turning a pale, sick gray in the east. Dawn was coming. Below her, in a deep cut carved by a tributary of the main river, she saw a flicker, a tiny orange spark, almost invisible. She half fell, half slid down the embankment, pulling Grits with her. She found him by the black, frozen line of the river. He had not been able to build a proper camp. He had found a small overhang, a cut bank where the river had carved into the earth, and was trying to build a small lean-to against it. He had a tiny, smoky fire going, built from frozen willow branches. It was a pathetic defense against the cold. His horse was tied nearby, blanketed, shivering violently. He had not made it to Utah. He had not even made it 10 miles. He was just trying to survive the next hour. He heard her in one fluid, impossibly fast motion. He was on his feet, his rifle at his shoulder. The hammer clicked back. He was a shadow against the gray snow, his face black with exhaustion and frostbite. "Clara?" His voice was a raw croak of disbelief. She could not speak. She stumbled toward him, her legs giving way, and fell to her knees in the snow. She pulled the letter from her coat. It was stiff, frozen. "His name," she gasped, her breath clouding in front of her. "His name, the man, the one who lied." She pushed the paper at him. He did not lower his rifle. "What are you doing here?" he demanded. "I told you." "Read it!" she screamed, her voice cracking. "Damn you! Eli, read the letter!" He stared at her, at the wild, desperate look in her eyes. He lowered the rifle. He took the letter from her hand. His own thick gloves fumbled with the brittle paper. He held it up to the faint, growing light. He read the faded pencil lines. She watched his face. She saw the confusion. She saw the slow, dawning comprehension. She saw the moment the name hit him. His head snapped up. His eyes, in the half-light, were burning. "Silas Croft," he whispered. "He was a freighter," Clara said, pulling herself to her feet. "He was in Laramie. He argued with the agent, James. James heard it. He told the sheriff. And Silas lied. He framed him. He framed my husband and let him hang." Eli looked from the letter to her face. The universe, which had been a vast, chaotic thing, suddenly snapped into a single, sharp point. The man hunting him for an accidental death was the man who had murdered her husband by proxy. It was all one story. One snake, eating its own tail. "He was in my house," she said, her voice trembling with the rage that was finally boiling over. "He was in my house, and I sent you—" "You have to go back," he said, his voice flat. "Get on your horse, ride east. Don't stop until you hit Laramie." "No, we are going back." "Don't be a fool," he said, turning away, beginning to kick snow onto his small fire. "This is my fight. It's always been my fight. Now it's yours, too. But it's not a fight we can win. He's got 2 men. He's got the story on his side. We're just a killer and a crazy widow." "I don't care," she said. She walked up to him, grabbed his arm. He was solid, like a stone. "I am not running. I've been sitting in that cabin for 5 years. That was running. I'm done running." "You don't understand. Clara," he said, his voice hard. "They will kill you. They will kill you just for being with me. They will burn your post to the ground and ride on. That is who they are." "Then we fight them," she said. "We go back. We tell the town. We show them the letter. We show them who he is." He laughed, a short, bitter, ugly sound. "A letter? A 5-year-old letter? And the word of a killer? Clara, that's nothing. That's wind." It's the truth. The truth don't matter out here, he shouted, turning on her. The only thing that matters is who's faster, who's stronger. And they are 3, and we are 2, and I am done killing. You killed him, she whispered. Caleb Sr., by accident. Silas. He killed James. On purpose. Don't you see? It's the same. He's the one. He's the poison. We have to stop him. Eli stared at her, at the absolute conviction on her face. He saw the woman he had met, the cold, hard widow. And he saw the woman who had cried in his arms. And now he saw this new woman, a woman of fire and iron, born from a frozen letter. He let out a long, ragged breath. He looked at the sky. The wind was picking up again, and the gray light was flat. A ground blizzard was starting, the snow beginning to move in long, white snakes across the ice. I don't know how to do this. Clara, he said, his voice raw with a decade of weariness. I don't know how to make things right. I don't know how to talk to towns or show letters to sheriffs. I've just been running. He looked at her, his eyes softening. I don't know how to be the man you need. I'm not James. I know, she said. James is dead. He paused, then nodded. He reached out and touched her face, his gloved thumb brushing the ice from her scarf. I don't know how to do the right thing, he said, but I know how to protect you. That was his promise. We go back, he said, but not to the post. It's the first place they'll look. We'll have to... The wind hit them then, a solid wall of ice that staggered them both. It was no longer just a wind. It was a storm, reborn. The air was full of white. We can't travel in this, he yelled over the shriek. We'll be lost in 5 minutes. We have to camp, here. They worked with a frantic, desperate energy. The world was disappearing around them. They were in a white bowl, the sky and the earth indistinguishable. The tent, he roared. They unstrapped it from her saddle, the canvas fighting them, snapping like a bullwhip. They moved to the cut bank, the small overhang, and fought to stake it down, their hands numb, their bodies clumsy. The wind tore a stake from his hand and sent it skittering into the white void. Use the rocks, she screamed. They found frozen stones, buried in the snow, and used them to anchor the corners. They got the poles in, the tent lurching and collapsing. Finally, it held a small, triangular patch of canvas against the fury of the storm. The horses, he yelled. They led the 2 animals into the shallow cave of the cut bank, as close to the tent as they could get, their backs to the wind. Eli tied them, then threw all their blankets over them. They'll freeze, Clara cried. They have a better chance than us if we stay out here, he shouted. He grabbed her arm and dragged her toward the tent. Get in, now! He ripped the flap open, pushed her inside, and scrambled in behind her, pulling the flap closed, tying it shut. The sound stopped. It did not get quiet. The wind was still a deafening, constant roar, a sound so loud it was a physical pressure on the canvas, but the stinging and cutting ice was gone. They were in a small, dark, flapping space, no bigger than a coffin. They knelt, facing each other, breathing hard, their breath pluming in the frigid air. It was colder in the tent than it had been outside, the canvas offering shelter but no warmth. We're trapped, Clara whispered, the reality of it hitting her. We're alive, Eli said. He fumbled in his pack and pulled out a small, tin lantern. His hands were shaking so badly from the cold he could barely strike the match. On the 3rd try, it lit. He lit the candle, and the tent was filled with a weak, flickering, yellow light. It showed her his face. His beard was caked with ice. There were white, waxy patches on his cheeks. Frostbite. Your face, she said, her voice trembling. He touched his cheek, his expression numb. It's nothing. They sat, huddled, shivering. The cold was absolute. It came up from the frozen ground, through the thin canvas, through their layers of clothes. It was a living, malicious thing, and it was trying to kill them. "We have to," Eli started, his teeth chattering. "We have to share warmth, or we won't. We won't last till nightfall." He unrolled his single bedroll. It was not enough for two. "Take it," he said. I'll sit." "No," Clara said. We'll both sit on top of it." They arranged the bedroll and her own saddle blanket, making a thin, poor barrier against the ground. They sat side by side, their shoulders touching, their knees drawn up. They were still shivering, violently. "It's not enough," he said, his voice thick. Clara looked at him. This man, this stranger, this killer, this victim. He had been in her life for 2 days, and he had shattered it and rebuilt it. She saw the lines of pain around his eyes, the deep, abiding weariness. He was preparing to die. He had been preparing for it for 10 years. She had been dead for 5. "You're wrong," she whispered. He turned to look at her, his face inches from hers in the cramped space. "What?" You said you didn't know how to do the right thing. You did. You came back to my cabin. You listened. You knelt on my floor." "Clara, I sent you out to die," she said, her voice breaking. "I was a coward. I was just like them. The mob. I was so afraid of losing my things that I threw you away." "You were scared," he said. "I brought it to you." "And I shouldn't have come," he whispered, his own guilt rising. "I should have kept riding. I'm death. I'm a curse." "So am I," she said. She looked at his mouth, chapped and rimmed with ice. She looked at his eyes, dark and lost. She leaned forward. The kiss was not soft. It was not a kiss of love. It was a kiss of pure, desperate, animal survival. His lips were frozen, hard. His beard was rough and wet with melted ice. She pushed against him, her gloved hand coming up to his jaw, holding him. He was stiff, frozen, shocked. Then a groan came from deep in his chest. His arm, a heavy, solid thing, came around her back, pulling her against him. He kissed her back, and it was all the rage, and the guilt, and the 10 years of running, and the 5 years of her grief, all in one. It was a bruising, angry, needy kiss. It broke, and they were both gasping, their breath white clouds in the lantern light. They were trembling, but it was not just from the cold. "Clara," he breathed, his forehead resting against hers. "We're going to die in here," she whispered. "No," he said, his voice a low, fierce rumble. "No, we are not." He did not let her go. His arm was a band of steel around her. He pulled her closer, his other hand coming up to hold the back of her head. He just held her, crushing her against his chest. She buried her face in the rough wool of his coat. It smelled of pine smoke, and horse, and him. It was the first time she had felt safe, truly safe. In 5 years, she was in the arms of a man hunted by her husband's killer, in the middle of a blizzard, and she was safe. She held on to him, her hands gripping his coat, and she let the shudders run through her. They were not from the cold. They sat like that for a long time, just breathing, holding each other. The wind outside was a raging, forgotten god. The cold began to creep back in. The brief heat of the kiss was gone. The shivering started again. "It's not enough," she whispered into his chest. "I know." She pulled back, just enough to look at him. The lantern light cast shadows across his hard face. She saw the man who had knelt by her bed. She saw the man who had faced down Silas. She made a decision. It was not born of love or of lust. It was born of necessity. It was born of the truth that this was the only warmth, the only life left in the world. She reached down, her hands fumbling, and untied the flap of her bedroll. She unbuttoned her heavy coat. "Clara, what?" "Get in," she said. It was an order, I can't. You will, she said, her voice raw. We will not freeze. Not now. I didn't ride all this way to freeze to death. She pulled him. She was strong, her arms corded from splitting wood and hauling sacks. She pulled him down, onto the blankets, and with a desperate, clumsy strength, she pulled him to her, into her blankets, into her... It was a fumbling, awkward tangle of heavy winter clothes, of frozen leather and rough wool. But then his arms were around her, inside her coat, and his body was pressed against hers. He was solid and hard, and blessedly, shockingly warm. "Oh, God," he whispered, as her cold hands found the skin of his neck. She pulled his head down and kissed him again, and this time there was no anger. It was just a deep, slow, melding. They did not speak. There were no words for this. It was a language of necessity. His hands were rough, calloused, and they trembled as they moved over her, over the layers of wool, finding the shape of her. She was the one. She was the one who was alive, who was driving this. She pulled at his coat, at his shirt, her own hands numb, needing to feel. The cold air hit their skin, making them gasp. But they drove on, seeking the heat. This was not the gentle, familiar love of her marriage. This was something else. This was a coming together of two broken, jagged pieces. It was a raw, honest, and painful thing. It was the scrape of his beard, the desperate strength in his arms, the way he held her, as if she were the only thing keeping him from blowing away in the wind. He moved over her, and she took his weight, a solid, grounding thing. When he finally pushed into her, a sharp, sudden cry escaped her, a sound of pain and relief, and a life so long dormant it was an agony to wake it. He froze. I hurt you." "No," she gasped, her hands clutching his back. "Don't stop! Don't you dare stop!" And in the small, flapping tent, with the wind screaming for their deaths, they loved each other without words. It was a desperate, raw, and silent fight against the cold and the dark, a final, defiant act of life. Afterward, they lay tangled, their bodies slick with sweat that was already chilling in the frigid air. They were breathing in harsh, ragged gasps, the white clouds of their breath mingling in the dim light. The wind was still howling, but it seemed distant, unimportant. They pulled the blankets over them, huddling together, their limbs intertwined, sharing every last, precious scrap of body heat. They fell asleep, not into peace, but into a deep, exhausted oblivion. The world was silent when they woke. The storm was gone. A faint gray light filtered through the canvas. It was morning. Clara woke first. She was stiff, her body aching. She was pressed against Eli, his arm a heavy weight across her waist, his face buried in her hair. The shame hit her first, a hot, scalding wave. The intimacy of the dark felt like a transgression in the cold light. What had she done? She pulled away, slowly, carefully. He woke instantly, his eyes snapping open. He was a man who never slept deeply. They stared at each other for a second, and then they both looked away. The small tent was a wreck, their clothes scattered, the air stale and cold. He started. "Don't," she said, her voice small. They dressed in a thick, suffocating silence. Their fingers were clumsy, their movements stiff. They did not look at each other. They were two strangers, forced to witness each other's most private, desperate moments. Eli broke the silence. He cleared his throat. "I'll check the horses." He untied the flap and crawled out. Clara sat there for a minute, her coat pulled tight. She did not know what she felt. She was not the widow. She was not the avenger. She was just a woman, sore and cold, and profoundly, terrifyingly alive. She followed him out. The world was bright white, the air still and sharp. The horses were alive, covered in snow, shivering but standing. They packed the camp in silence. They moved around each other. Two partners in a dance they had not learned, each anticipating the other's needs. He took down the tent while she readied the horses. She packed the food while he secured the bedrolls. It was time to go. She moved to grits, putting her foot in the stirrup. "Clara." She stopped. She turned. He was standing by his own horse, his face grim in the morning light. The frostbite on his cheeks was a dark, angry patch. He walked toward her. He was not wearing his gloves. His hands were raw and red. He stopped in front of her. He did not touch her face. He did not pull her into his arms. He just reached out and took her gloved hand. He held it. His grip was firm, warm, and sure. It was not a lover's caress. It was a statement. It was a promise. It was the grasp of a man who had been drowning and had found a solid rock. He looked at her, his eyes finally meeting hers, and in his gaze, she saw no shame. She saw no regret. She saw only the man who had knelt on her floor, the man who knew how to protect her. He squeezed her hand. Once, it was enough. "Let's go," he said. He let her go, turned, and swung up onto his horse. Clara mounted hers, and side by side, they rode east, back toward the world that had tried to bury them both. The ride back to the supply post was a silent, grinding agony. Every plod of the horse's hooves in the deep snow was a hammer blow against the silence. They did not speak of the tent. They did not speak of the night. The shame and confusion of the morning had been burned away, replaced by the cold, clear purpose of the letter. What had happened between them in the storm was a thing of necessity, a desperate act of life. What they were riding toward was an act of justice. When they reached the cabin, the sun was low, painting the endless snowfields in shades of bloody orange and cold purple. The world was beautiful, and it did not care. Clara slid from her horse, her body a single, solid ache. The cabin was as she had left it, a tomb of cold air. The 10 beaver pelts were still scattered on the floor where she had thrown them, a dark, rich accusation. Eli dismounted and stood beside her on the porch. He looked at the cabin, then at her. He was waiting. This was her home, her fight. He was only a weapon, and he was waiting for her to aim him. "We go inside," she said, her voice a dry rasp. "We light the stove. We make a plan." Inside, the cold was so deep it felt solid, while Eli coaxed a fire from the embers in the stove. Clara moved with a new, grim energy. She picked up the 10 furs, one by one. Her hands were steady. She folded them, her movements precise, and stacked them on the counter. They were his payment, and she had, in every sense, accepted it. She put the coffee pot on. The smell of it, strong and bitter, was the first normal thing in days. They sat at the small table, James's letter spread between them, the tintype of her and James beside it. "He's a runner," Eli said, his voice low. He touched the edge of the letter. "Silas, he lied and he ran. He's been running his whole life, just like me, only he runs toward trouble, and I run from it." "He's not going to run this time," Clara said. "He thinks I'm a lone woman. He thinks you're dead in the snow. He's comfortable. He's drinking my whiskey 3 miles away, feeling smart." "So, what's the plan? Clara, we can't just go to Laramie. The marshal there, he's a company man. He won't listen to us. Not against a man like Croft, who probably has friends." "I know," she said. "The law in Laramie failed James. It won't fail me." She looked past him, her eyes fixed on the darkening window. "The law is just men. We need better men." "There are no better men out here," Eli said, his voice bitter. "Yes, there are," she said. "There's Reverend Alden. He buried James. He was new to Laramie then, but he looked sad. He knew it was wrong. And he's still there. He's a good man." "A preacher?" Eli shook his head. "Clara, a preacher against 3 guns? Not just him. There's Judge Hemlock. From Cheyenne. He's a circuit judge. But he's a federal man. He's hard, but he's fair. James spoke of him. He was supposed to hear a case in Laramie, but he got delayed by the snow. If he had been there, her voice broke, just for a second. If he had been there, James would be alive. So we send for a preacher and a judge. How? We're snowed in. By the time they get this, if they get it, Silas and his men will be gone. Or we'll be dead. We use Finn. Eli looked confused. Finn? Finn, Brody. He's 17. His family has a small ranch, about 8 miles east. He's the only one who checks on me. He rides in every 2 weeks, checks my mail. He's a good boy. He was sweet on me. For a time. You'll send a boy? I'll send him to the telegraph station at Rock Creek, she said, her mind working fast, the fog of 5 years clearing. It's closer than Laramie. He can ride there. Send the wires. 1 to Reverend Alden, 1 to Judge Hemlock in Cheyenne. We tell them we have new evidence in the murder of James Mayhew. We tell them the man who framed him is here. And we tell them we have a witness to another killing. We tell them... She looked at Eli. We tell them Silas Croft is here. Eli was quiet for a long time, turning his tin cup in his raw, scarred hands. It's a thin rope. Clara, it could snap. It relies on a boy, a telegraph operator, and 2 men who might not even care. It's the only rope we have, she said. They'll come back before then, he said. Silas, Boone, Caleb, they're not just going to sit in that shack. They'll come back for me. Or, when they see I'm gone, they'll come back for you. I know, Clara said. We have to make them. Make them? We have to set a trap, and we have to bait it. She looked at him, her eyes hard. You're the bait. His first instinct, the one that had kept him alive for 10 years, screamed at him to get on his horse and ride. But he looked at her, at the absolute, terrifying certainty on her face. He had run, all his life. He had run from the ghost of Caleb Sr. He had run from Silas. He had, in his own way, run from her when he'd left her cabin. He thought of her, riding into that blizzard, holding that frozen letter. She had not run. All right, he said. His voice was steady. I'm the bait. What's the trap? The trap, she said, is this cabin and the truth. The next day, Finn Brody arrived. He was a tall, gangly youth with a shock of red hair and a face full of freckles, riding a mule that looked as stubborn as he did. He was shocked to see Eli's horse in the barn. He was more shocked to see the look in Clara's eyes. The dull, vacant look was gone. She was alive. I'm Mrs. Mayhew, he stammered, his hat in his hands. You're all right? I saw riders. I'm fine. Finn, she said. She gave him coffee and a piece of hardtack. But I need you. I need you more than I've ever needed anyone. She explained it. She did not give him all the details. She just gave him the facts. A bad man, Finn, a man named Silas Croft. He was responsible for Mr. Mayhew's death. He's here. I need you to send these telegrams. You cannot tell anyone, not a soul. You ride to Rock Creek. You give this to the operator, and you wait for a reply. She pressed $2 silver into his hand. This is for the wires, and for your silence. The boy looked at the money, then at her, then at Eli, who stood in the shadows of the cabin, watching. Finn was young, but he was not stupid. He understood the weight of the moment. He nodded, his face grim. I'll ride fast, Mrs. Mayhew. I'll ride like hell is after me. It is, Finn, she said. It is. He left, and the waiting began. It was the hardest 2 days of their lives. The silence in the cabin was a living thing. They could not speak of the tent. They could not speak of the future. They could only speak of the plan. Eli took the barn. He cleaned his rifle. He cleaned his pistol. He sharpened his knife. He moved with a restless, caged energy. Clara stayed in the cabin. She baked bread. She scrubbed the floor. She mended. They moved in their separate spheres, 2 planets held in orbit by a single, dark star, Silas Croft. At night, it was worse. He slept in the storeroom, on the feed sacks. She slept in her bed. The wall between them was as thin as paper. She lay awake, listening to him cough, listening to him shift. She knew he was not sleeping. They were alone, together, in the vast, waiting dark. The memory of his body, of his warmth, was a fire she could not put out. On the 3rd morning, Finn returned. He was gray with exhaustion, his mule half dead. "They're comin'," he gasped, falling from the saddle. Eli caught him. "They're comin' together. The Reverend. He wired the judge. The judge. He's bringing 2 marshals. He wired back. He said, 'Hold. We ride at dawn. We will be there by the 4th day.'" The 4th day. Clara breathed. That's tomorrow." He said, "Do not engage. Wait for the law." Clara looked at Eli. "He doesn't know Silas. Silas won't wait for the law." As if the world was listening, Eli, who had been scanning the horizon, went still. "Clara," he said, his voice deadly soft, "get the boy inside." She looked. 3 riders, coming from the west. They were not hurrying. They were moving at a slow, deliberate, confident walk. "Get in the loft," Eli commanded Finn, "and do not make a sound. You hear me? No matter what." The boy, terrified, scrambled into the barn and up the ladder. "Eli, the plan," Clara said, her heart a cold drum. "The plan is broken," he said. "They're here a day early. The judge is not. Get in the house. Clara, bar the door. This is my fight. I'll lead them off." "No," she said. She stood on the porch, her feet planted. "No more running. Not you, not me. The plan is the plan. The truth is the truth. It doesn't matter if the judge is here or not. It has to be said." "Clara, they will kill you," he hissed, his face a mask of terror for her. "They already killed me," she said. "I'm just waiting to tell them about it." She pulled her apron tight. The small weight of the Smith & Wesson in her pocket was a comfort. "Get inside, in the back room. Don't come out. Not unless—" "Not unless what?" "Not unless he draws on me," she said. He stared at her, his mind warring with a decade of survival instincts. To let her stand there, alone, it was impossible. "Trust me, Eli," she whispered. "This is my home, my name, my husband. This part is mine." He looked at her for one long, agonizing second. Then he nodded, his jaw tight, and slipped back into the dark of the cabin, leaving the front door open. An invitation. Clara stood by the porch rail. She did not move. She just waited. They rode up and dismounted. Silas, Boone, and young Caleb. They looked tired and angry. "Widow," Silas grunted. He stomped the snow from his boots. "We're looking for our friend, Abel, or Eli, whatever he calls himself." "I don't know any such man," Clara said, her voice clear and cold. It did not tremble. Silas laughed, a low, ugly sound. "Don't you? He was here. We saw him. Did he run out on you? He's good at that." "The only man I know who's good at running," Clara said, "is you, Silas Croft." The name hit him like a physical blow. He stopped, his foot on the first step of the porch. Boone, behind him, froze. Caleb just looked confused. What did you call me?" Silas said, his voice losing its rumble, becoming sharp. "I called you Silas Croft," Clara said, her voice ringing in the cold, still air. "I know you. You were a freighter. You were in Laramie 5 years ago. You were in the Silver Dollar Saloon. You argued with a cattle agent named Henderson. You told him you'd see him in hell. Silas's face went pale under his beard. His hand drifted, just slightly, toward his gun. I don't know what you're talking about, lady. You were arguing over a land swindle. Clara continued, her voice rising, each word a hammer blow. He sold the same land twice, and when he was found shot in the back, you let another man hang for it, a man named James Mayhew, my husband. She's crazy, Boone hissed, his scarred face twisting. Silas, she's crazy. No, Clara said. I'm a widow. You made me a widow. He left a letter. He wrote your name down. He told the sheriff, but the sheriff wouldn't listen. And you stood by and watched a good man hang. You murdered him, Silas, just as sure as if you'd pulled the trigger. Pa? Caleb's voice was a high, thin reed. What is she talking about? You told me. Shut up, boy! Silas roared. He was no longer the confident man. He was a cornered rat. This is a lie, a crazy woman's lie. Is it? From the doorway of the cabin. Eli stepped out. He did not have his rifle. His hands were empty, at his sides. Is it a lie? Silas, tell me. Silas staggered back, his face a mask of disbelief. You're supposed to be dead. You thought I'd freeze, Eli said. But you're the one who's cold. Silas. Pa? Caleb was weeping now, looking from Eli to Silas. What's happening? We were hunting him for what he did to Pa. He lied to you, Caleb, Eli said, his voice gentle. I told you. It was an accident. I was shooting at Boone. Your father, he stepped in the way. It was a terrible, terrible accident. And I've paid for it, every day for 10 years. But this man murdered her husband. He let him hang. And he's your pa's brother. Uncle Silas. Caleb looked at Silas, his world collapsing. He's lying, boy, Silas screamed. He's a killer. He's trying to save his own skin. Then what about Boone? Eli said, his eyes locking on the scarred man. You were there, Boone. You were there in Colorado. You were there in Laramie. You're the one who started it all. Tell him. Tell the boy the truth. Boone was sweating, despite the cold. His eyes darted from Eli to Silas, to Clara. I don't. Silas. Shut your mouth, Silas commanded. No, Clara said, stepping forward. No more shutting mouths. No more lies. You will answer for what you did. Silas. That was when it broke. It was not Silas. It was Boone, the man who had been shot, the man who had lived in fear. He couldn't take it. He let out a high animal scream. Shut her up, he shrieked, and his hand clawed for his pistol. He wasn't aiming at Eli. He was aiming at Clara. No, Eli roared. He moved. He was not a runner. He was a wall. He threw himself in front of her, his body crashing into hers, pushing her back against the cabin wall. The world exploded in a single deafening crack. Eli grunted, a deep, sharp sound, and his whole body arched against her. He looked down, at his shoulder, a look of almost academic surprise. A dark, wet stain was spreading, blooming, on his shirt. He had been shot. Clara screamed. It was not a scream of fear. It was a scream of pure, undiluted rage. Boone was raising his gun again, his face a mask of panic, fumbling to cock the hammer. Silas had his own pistol out, swinging it toward Eli's fallen form. Clara's hand was in her pocket. The Smith & Wesson was small, but it was there. She pulled it. She did not think. She did not aim. She just pointed it at the man who had murdered her husband. She pointed it at Silas. And she pulled the trigger. The sound was small, a sharp pop compared to the roar of Boone's Colt. Silas grunted, his eyes wide with shock. He looked down at his own shoulder. A small, dark hole had appeared. He dropped his gun. He had been hit. Clara stood there, the small pistol smoking in her hand, her arm outstretched. She had done it. After 5 years of holding it, she had finally, truly, used it. "Drop it!" a new voice boomed, cutting through the ringing in her ears. "Drop your weapons! Federal marshals!" 4 riders came at a gallop around the side of the barn. 2 were in uniform. One was an old, stern-looking man with a white beard, in a long black coat. The other was Reverend Alden. They had come a day early. Boone, his gun still in his hand, looked up, wild-eyed. One of the marshals fired a warning shot into the porch roof, splinters raining down. Boone dropped his pistol as if it were on fire. Caleb had not moved. He was just standing by his horse, his face white, tears frozen on his cheeks. "Reverend," Clara gasped, her pistol falling from her numb fingers. She ran to Eli, who had slumped against the wall. Eli, I'm—" He coughed, blood on his lips. "I'm all right. Clara, it's just the shoulder. Feels familiar." The Judge Hemlock, dismounted, his face like granite. "What in God's name happened here, Mrs. Mayhew?" "He shot him," Clara said, pointing a trembling finger at Boone. "And he—" She pointed at Silas, who was clutching his bleeding shoulder. "He's Silas Croft. He's the man from the letter." She ran inside, grabbed the letter from the table, and ran back, pushing it into the judge's hand. The judge read it. The Reverend read it over his shoulder. "Silas Croft," the judge said, his voice flat. He looked at Silas. "I remember this. I remember that name. There was talk that the Laramie court had been too fast, that the evidence was thin." It was a lie. Clara wept, holding Eli's hand. He confessed. He told us." "He did not," Silas spat. "Shut up, Silas," Boone whimpered, his hands in the air. It's over. He knows. They know." The marshals had Silas and Boone in cuffs. Young Caleb just stood there, lost. "What about him, sir?" one of the marshals asked, gesturing to the boy. Caleb looked at the judge. My PA was Caleb Sr. That man," he pointed at Eli. He killed him. My uncle Silas. He told me. He said we were hunting him. For justice." "Your father's death was a tragic accident, son," Judge Hemlock said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "I remember that, too, from Colorado. But your uncle, he's been filling your head with poison. He's been using your grief to hunt a man." The judge looked at Silas, his eyes cold. "And he's been hiding his own sins behind it. Manslaughter, maybe, but framing a man for murder? That's a hanging offense in this territory. Take them." The marshals dragged Silas and Boone away. Reverend Alden knelt beside Clara and Eli. "Dear Lord," he whispered. "Clara, you were right." People began to appear. Finn from the loft, and then others, a neighbor from 10 miles south, a trapper who had been on the trail. The news, the sound of the shots, it had traveled. They stood in the snow, in a wide, silent circle, watching. They saw the marshals, they saw the blood, they saw the men in chains, and they saw Clara. She was not the silent, crazy widow of the prairie. She was covered in Eli's blood, her face streaked with tears and gunpowder, and she was holding the hand of the man who had saved her. She was the woman who had faced down 3 killers, the woman who had, after 5 long years, brought her husband's murderer to justice. They looked at her, and for the first time, they saw her. "Let's get him inside," the Reverend said, his voice firm. "Let's get him warm." Clara, with the Reverend's help, half-dragged, half-carried Eli into the cabin. She laid him on her own bed, the bed James had never slept in. He was pale, his skin waxy. The frostbite on his face was dark, and the blood from his shoulder was soaking her sheets.
"Clara,"
he whispered, his eyes fluttering. "Shh," she said. She was tearing strips from a clean sheet. "Don't talk. The Reverend is going to get the bullet. You just hold on." She worked, her hands sure, cleaning the wound, packing it, her mind clear and cold. She was a nurse. She was a survivor. She worked all day and all night. The Reverend helped. The judge sat in her chair, drinking her coffee, writing his report. The townspeople, they left. But they left things on her porch: a sack of flour, a haunch of venison, a jar of preserves, a silent, humble offering. By the next morning, the judge and the marshals were gone, taking their prisoners. The fever had set in. Eli was delirious, tossing in the bed, calling out names: Caleb, James, Clara. She sat by him. She did not sleep for 2 days. She spooned water and broth into his mouth. She bathed his face. She held his hand when he thrashed. She listened to his broken confessions, to his fears, to his 10 years of pain. On the 3rd day, the fever broke. He woke. The cabin was quiet. The sun was streaming in the window. He was weak, but his eyes were clear. He saw her, asleep in the chair by his bed, her head slumped on her chest. He reached out, his hand trembling, and touched her hair. She woke instantly. They just looked at each other for a long time. The cabin was warm. It smelled of coffee and clean bandages. "You," he said, his voice a dry croak. "You saved me." "You saved me," she said. He looked around the small room. He looked at her. He saw the exhaustion in her face. He saw the new, strong lines around her mouth. "So," he whispered, You'll just kick me out when I'm healed?" He was afraid, after all of it. After the fight, the storm, the confession, the shooting. He was still the runner. He was still the man who would be told to move on. Clara felt the tears well in her eyes. The tears she had not shed for 5 years. They were not tears of grief. They were tears of something else. She stood up and leaned over him. She put her hand on his good cheek, the one that wasn't scarred by the frost. Her thumb brushed his beard. "No," she said, her voice thick. "Not if you still want to stay." The Wyoming winter did not release its grip. It held on, a mean, cold fist, long into what should have been spring. But inside the cabin, there was a thaw. It was slow and awkward, and it came with the unsteady drip of melting ice. Eli healed. His body, hard and accustomed to punishment, knitted itself back together with a stubborn resilience. Clara was his nurse, but that role began to blur. The first day he was able to sit up on his own. She had found him trying to stand, his face pale with the effort. He had swayed, and she had caught him. And for a long moment, they were simply 2 people. His good arm thrown over her shoulder, her body supporting his weight. It was not like the tent. It was not desperate. It was just necessary. "I can stand," he'd said, his voice a low growl of frustration. "I know," she'd said, her voice soft, and had helped him back to the bed. When he could finally walk, the cabin became too small. It was a space built for one solitary ghost, not 2 living, breathing people, each carrying the weight of their own past and the new, fragile weight of their shared one. They moved around each other with a careful, quiet courtesy. He would wake early, before the sun, and add wood to the stove, his movements quiet, trying not to wake her from her own sleep in the chair. She would wake, pretending she hadn't been listening to him breathe all night, and put the coffee on. They did not speak of the storm. They did not speak of the night they had clung to each other. They did not speak of the shooting. Instead, they spoke of practical things. "The roof on the barn," he said one morning, his good arm testing the weight of a log. His shoulder was still bound, his other arm in a sling she had fashioned. It needs more than shingles. The north beam is warped. It's always been warped, she replied, kneading bread. It'll come down in the next heavy snow, he said. I can fix it. When this is, he gestured to his sling. When you're healed, she said. It was not a question. It was a statement. He was staying. It was the first time it had been said. He just nodded, and the silence that followed was comfortable, solid, like the log walls of the cabin. The name love was never spoken. It was a word that belonged to a different world. It belonged to men like James, who whistled and read poetry. Theirs was a different language, a language of action, of shared burdens, of quiet presence. Love was the sound of him, finally healed, splitting wood. The steady thwack, 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 a new heartbeat for the post. It was the sight of her, mending his coat, the one he had worn for 10 years, her stitches small and neat, erasing the tears and bullet holes of a long, hard life. It was him, taking her rifle, cleaning it with a professional, all-silent care, and handing it back to her, a gesture of profound respect. As the snows finally, grudgingly, began to melt, the world returned, the trail opened, and people, hearing the story, began to come. The supply post was no longer just a post. The first travelers were a family, their wagon wheels split, stranded. Clara had looked at them, at the cold, tired mother and the 2 small, hungry children. She had looked at Eli, who was standing on the porch, his hammer in his hand. They can't stay in the wagon, she'd said. No, he'd agreed. The barn's warm, but it's not a place for them. He had spent the next 2 weeks working. He was a builder. He had a builder's hands. He took the lumber from an old, collapsed line shack, salvaged it, and with Clara's money for nails and glass, he expanded the post. He built 2 small, clean rooms onto the back of the cabin, each with a small stove and a sturdy cot. Clara, meanwhile, had changed. The news of what she had done, what they had done, had traveled faster than any telegraph. When she rode to Laramie for supplies, the first time in 5 years, the town had stopped. People had come out of the saloon, out of the general store. They had watched her. The whispers were not of the crazy widow. They were of Clara Mayhew, the woman who had brought down Silas Croft, the man who had run their town, who had sat on their councils, had been a part of the posse. The shame of what they had done to James was a palpable, ugly thing. No one spoke of it. No one apologized. But the smithy, the one who had lied. He came out and checked her horse's shoes. He did not charge her. They look solid. Mrs. Mayhew, he'd said, not meeting her eyes. She'll get you home safe. It was a start. Clara's provisions became Clara's way station. It was a place for travelers to rest, to get a hot meal, to have their tack mended. Eli's corner of the barn became a workshop. His hands, which had only known how to hunt, to survive, to kill, were now hands that created. He mended harnesses. He resoled boots. He worked leather with a slow, careful skill. He was a quiet man, and the travelers, who all knew the story, treated him with a respectful, cautious distance. He was not Abel the killer. He was Eli, the man who worked for Mrs. Mayhew. The townspeople began to visit, not for supplies. Not at first. Finn Brody came, his mother with him. She brought a jar of apple preserves and 2 laying hens. A gift, Clara, she'd said, calling her by her first name. For what you did, for Finn, he's proud of what he did. He's a good boy, Clara had said, accepting the gift. Others followed. Men who had been in that mob. They would ride up, buy a plug of tobacco they did not need, or a bag of grain. They would nod to Eli. See your building, one of them, a rancher named Stokes, had said, gesturing to the new rooms. Work needs doing, Eli had replied. his voice flat. "Aye." Stokes had lingered, clearing his throat. My wife, she sent a pie. Apple, said you might like it." He'd left it on the counter, paid for his tobacco, and left. It was not an apology. It was not forgiveness. It was a community, clumsy and ashamed, trying to mend a wound it had inflicted. It was a silent, slow, and stumbling request for atonement. Clara accepted it all with a quiet, hard-won grace. She was no longer a victim. She was a proprietor. She and Eli lived this new life. They worked side by side, a well-oiled machine. They ate their meals together, often in a silence that was full of the day's work. The nights were the hardest. He had moved his things, what little he had, into one of the new rooms he had built. It was proper. It was respectful. And it was a lie. The wall between her room and his was just as thin, and the memory of the cold, of the tent, of the desperate, life-affirming heat. It was a ghost that sat between them at every meal. They were partners in everything but the one thing that had saved them. The seasons turned. The high country summer, short and brilliant, gave way to the sharp, cold breath of autumn. The wind began to whine again. The first snows were not far off. They had worked hard. The barn was full of hay. The pantry was stocked. The new rooms were ready for winter travelers. They were safe. They were settled. One night, the first real snow of the season began to fall. It was not a blizzard. It was a quiet, gentle fall of thick, heavy flakes, covering the raw, scarred land in a blanket of clean, new white. Clara had finished washing the supper dishes. Eli had been quiet all night, his mind seemingly elsewhere. He had gone to the barn an hour earlier, saying he needed to check a harness. He came back in, the snow melting on his shoulders. He was carrying something. It was dark and heavy. He held it out to her. It was a cloak, a long, beautiful, heavy cloak, made of 10 perfect beaver pelts, the ones he had offered her, the ones she had thrown back at him. They were stitched together with a skill that shocked her. The leather was supple, the fur was dark and impossibly soft, the collar was high, and the inside was lined with a soft, worn wool. He had, she realized, lined it with his own old blanket. She stared at it, her hands rising to her mouth. She looked from the cloak to his face. I ain't no tailor," he said, his voice rough. "But I know fur, and I know the cold. It's for you." She did not speak. Her throat was too thick. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and touched the fur. It was the fur of his past. It was his payment. It was his life before her, and he had taken it, taken his old life, and fashioned it into a gift for her new one. "Put it on," he urged, his voice quiet. She let him. She turned, and he settled the heavy cloak on her shoulders. The weight of it was a shock. It was an embrace. It was the heaviest, most solid thing she had ever worn, and it was warm, a deep, profound warmth that sank into her bones. She pulled the high collar up, burying her face in the soft fur. It smelled of him, of wood smoke and leather, and the faint, clean smell of the snow. She turned and walked, as if in a daze, to the cabin door. She opened it. The snow was falling thick and fast, a curtain of white in the glow of the porch lamp. The world was silent, hushed, and new. She stepped out onto the porch. Pulling the cloak tight, she stood there, in the falling snow, a queen in a robe of furs. He had followed her. He was standing at the edge of the porch, not touching her, just watching her. His face, in the lamplight, was full of a decade of fear, of running, of hoping. He held his bare hand out to her. Not to take, not to pull, just offered. Clara looked at him. She looked at the man who had been a killer, a refugee, a patient, a partner. She took a slow breath, the cold air sharp in her lungs. She asked the question that held their entire story. You still think I'm only worth 10 furs? Her voice was a whisper, almost lost in the snow. Eli looked at her. He saw her, not as the widow, not as the avenger, but as Clara, the woman who had ridden into a blizzard for him, the woman who had fought for him, the woman who had given him a home. He did not answer. He moved. He came up behind her as she stood looking out at the snow. He wrapped his arms around her, over the heavy cloak, pulling her back against his chest. He was a solid, warm wall behind her. He buried his face in her hair, breathing her in. "No," he whispered, his voice a raw, broken thing against her ear. "No, you gave me the rest of my life." She leaned back against him, her own gloved hand coming up to cover his, holding it tight against her heart. They stood there for a long time, two dark, solid shapes in the storm, as the snow fell and covered the world, making it clean. It was a hard winter, but it was not a lonely one. The final scene is not one of drama. It is one of peace. It is another night, months later. The way station is quiet, the travelers asleep in the new rooms. The wind is high, as it always is. But inside the cabin, the stove is a warm, orange heart. They are sitting on the porch, wrapped in blankets. The cloak, her cloak, is on her shoulders. They are not young. They are not unmarked. His face is scarred by the frost. Her eyes are lined with the memory of grief. But they are together. The snow is deep, a vast, blue-white ocean under the moon. They sit in their rockers, side by side. They are not talking. They are just watching the night. Eli reaches over, his scarred, calloused hand finding hers. She turns her hand, and their fingers lace together, a simple, solid, unbreakable grip. They sit there, looking out at the wilderness. They are not afraid of the wind. They are not afraid of the darkness. They are not afraid of the past. And they are not afraid of the silence. They have faced all of it, and they have found, in each other, a place to finally and completely rest. Thank you for listening to this story from Wild West. We're so glad to have you with us. Please, let us know in the comments where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with you. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts on Clara and Eli's journey.